Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Robert Bonde, who's joining us, and I want to get this just right, from the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Gainesville, Florida. And he also has a joint appointment to the Department of Veterinary Medical Sciences at the University of Florida. And if you go, and I'll encourage you to do this, and read through all of Dr. Bonde's list of credentials and experiences, you'll see that there are far too many for me to list. But I think it's fair to say, and I won't say grandfather, I will say the godfather. He is one of the godfathers of all manatee ecology research here in the United States. So we are very fortunate to have him talk to us. His expertise is manatee ecology and also population genetics. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And I appreciate the introduction. You don't need to know about me, but you need to know about manatees, because I'm here to talk about manatees because they're such an interesting animal. I've been studying them for 38 years, almost 40. When I put in some of the other time that I'd spent working with manatees, and I'm going to end up retiring probably next year, so I'm pretty excited about what I've learned. But what's been exciting with manatees is it's what we haven't learned yet, and every day we learn something new. I can't wait to wake up tomorrow and figure out what we don't know about manatees that we're learning. They don't cease to amaze us. They're fantastic animals. And because in that light, they're easy to talk about, and I could talk a long time about manatees, but I try to restrict it to 45 minutes and just highlight some of the things that are interesting about the manatees that you might come across in the course. How many of you have swum with manatees? Okay, so a good percentage of you. And that's because in Crystal River they have these swim with programs where they help educate people about manatees. They become advocates for their issues and their problems. They become more aware, and they help those manatees out in the long run. So manatees have needed our help. They don't have advocacy where they can go to Tallahassee and other places and they can lobby for themselves. They can literally have to rely on us to go out and provide that information about their needs and their wants. And we get that through the research that we do with these animals. So basically, what are manatees? If we go back far enough, we can trace their life to the Afrotherians about 100 million years ago. And the Afrotherians were a branch of mammals that diverged off 100 million years ago that later constituted the present-day elephants, aardvarks, and anteaters that are out there. So manatees and hyraxes. So manatees were part of this evolutionary process that began with the elephant. And that's pretty significant because if we look at them biologically and behaviorally, we see they do a lot of the things that the elephants do. They share a lot of common attributes and features. And I'll enlighten you to some of those as we go. About 70 million years ago, these Afrotherians, one group of them branched off. The rest stayed on continental Africa when it shifted away with plate tectonics away from South America. And the animals that stayed behind were part of the Prorastomus group. And Prorastomus were the ones that had hind limbs, like their elephant ancestors, and they crawled back into the water. Well, when they got in the water, through evolution and adaptation, they didn't need those hind limbs. They got in the way. So they evolved without hind limbs, and they developed about 41 million years ago into what are presently the two groups of Cyrenians that are out there. So what's a Cyrenian? A Cyrenian is an animal that's a mammal. It's so unique, it constituted its own separate order. And manatees were placed into this order because they were so dissimilar from all of the other mammals. And I mean, you can see the differences between the dogs and the cats and the cows. But manatees were so unique that they developed and had to be recognized as their own unique separate order. So when we talk about manatees being a marine mammal, they're actually an aquatic mammal. They're not as adapted to marine environments as the dolphins and the cetaceans, but they are aquatically adapted. And they do have a cousin, the dugong, that is a marine adapted animal. And there's lots of reasons how they can do that. And I'll get into some of their anatomical reasons as to why they can do those things as we go on with this. So if we look at the present day Cyrenians that are out there, we see in this order Cyrenia, we have a real large dugong-like creature. And the dugongs had tails that had a dolphin-shaped paddle or tail. And these were the marine individuals that if you look at their kidneys, they're more lobulated than manatee kidneys, so they can tolerate taking in more seawater and utilize that seawater for their freshwater needs. But the uniqueness about these two Cyrenians, and what's really unique about this one, is he's very large. And if we look at the distribution of all the Cyrenians, they're along the equator except for this guy that was up in the Bering Sea, and this is the stellar sea cow. If you open up a conservation biology book and you look, there's usually a page in there that talks about how this animal is unique because it was extincted in the 1700s by fur trade sealers that would go and take the easily killed stellar sea cow and stock up their supplies so they can go in and continue with their fishing operations. So as early as the 1700s, in a 20-year period, they extincted this marvelous animal. We never were able to study these animals or see these animals. Water under the bridge, we've lost that opportunity. What can we learn about the other Cyrenians? Well, its counterpart, the dugong, a sister in the family, is uniquely marine adapted, can tolerate and drink fresh water. Whereas the other Cyrenians, the other manatees, cannot drink salt water for long periods of time. They need a freshwater source. And that's why they stay linked to coastal areas or estuarine areas where they can go in and they can get water. Or they go in places like the St. Johns River where they can live their whole life in a freshwater environment and adapt to what that environment offers to them, which are the different kinds of vegetation that they're after. Now, if we look at the manatees, they're a little bit different. There's three groups. There's a Amazonian manatee that's found in the Amazon River basin. That's pretty logical. Its Trichechus anunguis means no nails on its flipper. Its skin is almost rubbery like a dolphin. And adaptively, they've designed themselves to live in a completely freshwater environment. And it's usually a tropical environment, so they're smaller in size. As you start to move out of the Amazon and along the West Indian range of the West Indian manatee, from Brazil up to Florida, we have some variations and some differences. And those differences are between the Florida manatee, which is the largest, and the Antillean manatee. It's a little bit smaller because it lives in more tropical kind of environments. So as you get in the northern limits or the southern limits of your range extension, and you're subjected to colder, cold temperatures, then your body takes on more mass to cope and deal with that. So they constantly have to regulate their temperature. Their physiology has to regulate, and they have to do that in a way that it enables them to survive through winters. In Florida and in the southeastern United States, we're familiar with this because seasonally in the summer they'll move into northern ranges, and then in the south, during the winter, they'll move south down to the power plants and the natural springs that are throughout Florida. We'll talk a little bit about that and that reliability on that as we go. So we have the two families, the Dugongidae and the Trichechidea, the manatees and the dugong. Now, to understand manatees and how they got into the southeastern United States, we've got to understand a little bit about sea level rise. And in situations where we have very cold environments, a lot of the water is sequestered up into ice in the polar caps, and you probably all know about this. And as it warms, that ice starts to melt, and it starts filling up the pot. And as sea level rises to midpoints, that's about where we are today. If we're in climate change and global warming trend, the water levels could go up and exceed as high as it did about a million years ago when water levels went in and inundated the Amazon River basin. And if you were a manatee, if you think about it, and you originated in the Amazon River basin, and the situation was like this, it was hard to move and patriate and disperse into areas to the north unless you went all the way out here and went up along the coast. But under these kinds of conditions, it was pretty easy to move and to branch into different environments. So how we've had manatees have the accessibility to break some of these vicarious barriers that are out there that they could use for genetically passing on their material is based on what's going on in the environment. And we looked at the genetics of manatees, and I just put this up. These are the haplotypes for the manatees, and we'll see some unique things about it. Most of the haplotypes, there's more diversity in the equatorial part of their distribution, and there's certainly less as the further north you go. And in fact, into Florida and the southeastern United States, we've only discovered one haplotype, a mitochondrial DNA haplotype. And so there's not a lot of diversity in the population related to the haplotypes that are out there. So we know basically that when this population emerged from here, it came out, probably moved up into this basin, And then as the sea level went down, it formed a peninsula here that prevented them from going back, but prevented the next pulse from going into this area, and they went up into this area. So we had almost two horns that diverged at about the same time, but separated by glacial events that prevented them from going in one place or the other, and isolated one group from the other group. Now, if we look at their anatomy, it's pretty interesting anatomically. If we look at the skull of a manatee on a dugong, we see there are striking differences. And this is a dugong skull. And you'll notice that there's rostral deflection. And the rostral deflection is a bend in the rostrum that takes a flat rostrum and bends it down. And this is also, you can maintain horizontal position in the water. So if you're a bottom feeder, it behooves you to have something like a hoe that you can go to the bottom and rake up rhizomes and get your spillage that way. If you're a surface feeder, it's kind of hard to stay horizontal and go up and feed at the surface like this with a bent rostrum. So the rostrum deflection changes with the different species. And we see when we get into the manatees, it's almost flat in the Amazonian manatee because they're in the Amazon. There isn't a lot of submerged vegetation. There isn't a lot of water clarity that allows light penetration to grow stuff down on the bottom anyway. So they spend most of their time pulling things down from the shore and from branches of trees and floating material in the water. So the adaptation that they've developed has been a flat rostrum to allow them to maintain that horizontal position in the water and achieve that at the same time. The Trichechus manatus, the Antillean manatee, has a little bit more rostral deflection than the Amazonian manatee, but less than the Florida manatee. So the Florida manatee is an intermediary, doesn't have as much as the dugong, isn't as much as the Amazonian, but it's bent a little bit more to allow them to be a little bit more generalist herbivore. And they can feed on different types of vegetation that are out there, but predominantly now, if you have it kind of halfway, you're like a partially open knife. You can go down and get things on the bottom, in the middle column, and up at the surface too. You can take advantage. And this took what happened. And through this, this is a rostral deflection. It's a derived character that you develop, and it's motivated by your behavior. If you're a bottom feeder, you're presented with a tool that works really well and gets you to the bottom to feed. If you're a surface feeder, that tool gets you to the surface. So it's motivated by the behavior, and it's rewarded by natural selection. If that works for you, you're going to do just fine in the environment. Now, if we go back about 5 million years ago, even less than that, maybe 3 million years ago, we had dugongs right out here in the Caribbean. And the dugongs were predominantly the largest group of Cyrenians within that region. There were three different species of dugongs that were out there. And they had this tool, which was a marine adapted tool. But when the last upheaval occurred and we had climate change and global warming that had taken place, sea level rose, there became more rain, the Caribbean became less marine, the seagrasses suffered from that, and they niched out, and these guys, the dugongs, went extinct, while the West Indian manatee and the Amazonian manatees were favoring pretty well because of the freshwater environment. So it took a very specialized feeder and extincted them, the dugong, and it replaced it with these manatees that were more adaptable, that could be more generalist feeders. And to also achieve this, now you've got the food in your mouth, you have to have a thing called hindmolar progression. And this is where, like the elephant that has a type of hindmolar progression, manatees have a similar device where newly generated teeth are at the back of the jaw and they work towards the front. And if you looked at this, if this manatee opened his mouth and you looked in there, you'd say, no, it's not moving his teeth at all. It's moving about 1 millimeter per month, as much as the orthodontist can do to manipulate your teeth with braces to move them to make space for the next tooth to move in. And it takes about 1 year for one tooth to move one space. So if this were a live manatee and it were living in a tank, every year it would have 4 little flat plates of teeth that would drop out into the tank, and a new tooth would have germinated and would have come up along the back and replaced it. So I'll pass this around and you can see how this works. Now it's a little bit different than the hyrax and the aardvarks and of course the elephant. Elephants have 3 to 4 teeth, and they're finite when they come out. When they wear down, they literally will die of starvation. They don't have a mechanism that allows them to feed and be successful at that point. So it's an age-limiting factor. Manatees have always had new teeth that have been promulgated and continue to erupt as they move through this kind of treadmill of teeth. It was that adaptation that allowed them to beat out the dugong. The dugong has a finite number of molars. When those molars are gone, you're going to die. When you all die, it becomes extinction, which happened in the Caribbean. So manatees are a fusiform body. They're pretty streamlined. You don't have appendages and things dragging out into the water. You can put radio tags on them, by the way, and learn a lot about manatees. This fusiform body, you have a flipper, and you might look at the flipper with a radiograph and you would see 5 digits. But it's encapsulated into skin to help with steerage and manipulation and movement. In fact, they will use their flippers to swirl and eddy water and vegetation down into their mouth so they can get to it. So it's a tool for them, but it also helps them with steerage. The vertebral column ends in a final caudal vertebra, and then there's like a spatulate tail at the back that allows them to propel themselves through the water. So this is all fibrous connective tissue. It's not as heavily vascularized, so you can see a lot of insult from injury from boat strikes and other things affecting the tail that don't necessarily kill the manatee, but it debilitates them to a certain degree. They're semi-social. Generally, the only true social bond is between the cow and the calf, and that's inseparable for the first 1 to 2 to 3 years until the mother decides she's going to wean that calf off and get pregnant again and produce another calf. So when you see a photograph like this, it's not that they're all buddies and they like to hang out together. They're all in a habitat that requires something that they're all after, and in this case it's warm water. So most of the aggregation points where a lot of manatees come together and they're gregarious and grouped is physiologically driven by either cold temperature or there's good vegetation out there, and they go and they utilize that vegetation and take advantage of it. So you'll see maybe a herd that's feeding. We've also had people that say, well, behind our house, we'll put a radio tag on a manatee. You'll go to the house, knock on the door, and say, can we come in your backyard, and there's a manatee in the canal behind your house. Oh, no, there aren't any manatees here. And then you go, well, we're pretty certain there's one out there. We go back there, and there's a radio tag, and it pops up, and they go, oh, yeah, and then look, there's another one over here. So pretty soon, we're opening our eyes to an environment that's almost as alien as another planet. But it's giving us uniqueness in that the more we learn about the marine environment, the aquatic environments, and the more we plunge ourselves into those environments, the better we are prepared to deal with things learning about our biology as well. And with manatees and any marine mammal, this is a significant feature. If you're an elephant, you're encumbered with the burden of gravity pulling you down, so your knees and your legs and you take a lot of that assault and effort. So there's a limit to the amount of size that you can maintain and still remain mobile when you're terrestrial. If you're aquatic, you get out of that realm. And that's kind of interesting because now your body grows faster than maybe your neurologic components in your brain and your other organs. So that has an interesting inference to it. And that inference, and here's some sounds. I don't have this linked up, but if we were to press this, you would hear the manatee making a vocalization. It's a squeak like a squeaky hinge. And it's a predominant noise. When manatees have something to say, they'll vocalize in that manner. And it's a real strong connection between, say, the cow and her calf. So if we flooded this room and put in 4 manatees in here and 2 mom pairs, and the moms were over here sleeping, and the calves were over here, and I went and pinched one of the calves, it would go, eek, and both moms would wake up, and one would go, oh, good, it's not mine, go back to sleep. The other one would come right over and investigate as to why that animal is giving this alert signal. So they do communicate with each other in that regard, and it's a very strong mechanism for maintaining the bond that the cows have with their calves. So noise pollution and other things can disrupt that mechanism that they use to identify the voice signatures between their own offspring. So more importantly, though, now we're back on the neurologic side. When we looked at manatee brains, we can see that if you look at a porpoise or a dolphin brain, it's like a human brain. It's very convoluted, a lot of surface area, very tactile abilities and functional abilities to investigate their prey. And you look at a manatee brain, and it's about the size of a grapefruit. It's still pretty large, but there's not much surface area at all. And in fact, in the 1800s, if you were a neuroanatomist and you looked at this brain, you would say, well, that brain is similar to what we observe in the physician's realm as mongoloid idiots, human patients. So in the equation of putting intelligence associated with what the brain looks like, we'll put the dolphins and the people and dogs and higher order pigs, mammals up here as being the smart level. And we're going to put manatees down here with the snails and the slugs, because they don't have much surface area. That brain is entirely different. Well, the new neuroanatomists came in the 1900s and told us, well, no, that's not a good way to quantify the cognitive ability of a brain. We have to section it and look at the neuron density associated with the brain. And lo and behold, when they looked in the manatee brain, they found a lot of neuron function that was associated with these, but it wasn't associated with the surface area as much as it was with their tactile abilities. So if we think about it, that brain is really good at echolocating, finding a fish, catching the fish, and swallowing it. This brain in a manatee is really good at sneaking up on vegetation, catching it off guard, and eating it. And that's what they do. So it's more important for that brain on the bottom to remember where the seagrass beds are. Because if they go there and the seagrass bed's not there, they have to have another plan. They have to remember. They have to have experiences that they relate to that. And remember they're related to elephants? We use an adage, an elephant never forgets. Well, that's the kind of brain that doesn't forget those kinds of things. It won't let him catch a fish. He won't be good at doing backflips in the water, but he's going to be good at sneaking up on plants and filling up his body. Now, if a manatee lives to be 3,000 or 4,000 pounds, and they've been up at the 4,000 pound range, it's pretty rare, but generally in adults over 1,000 pounds, they'll eat 10% of their body weight a day. So that's a good 100 pounds to 200 pounds of vegetation that an elephant might need to consume to get the energy that it needs to survive in the environment. If we look, they're eating machines. Manatees have another adaptation that's kind of unique, and it's called Toxicosis, and it's osteosclerotic bone. And this is dense bone. This is a manatee rib bone, and if this were a terrestrial mammal, we would cut it in half, and we would see in the middle there's a marrow cavity, and that's where we produce most of our red blood cells. Well, the manatees, if you cut it in half, it's solid, completely solid. In fact, during the Depression, they used to cut it, and they would scrimshaw it and call it poor man's ivory, and sell it as a kind of an artistic kind of thing when they were exploiting manatees a long time ago. And they were in the U.S., but recently manatees, of course, are protected. So they have this dense bone. Well, what good is that? Well, when I study manatees, I have the best job in the world. I put on a wetsuit, mask, fins, and snorkel, drop into the water, and I get to observe what they're doing in the environment. But if I do that, I've got to put on a weight belt so I maintain neutral buoyancy in the water, and I'm not struggling to get down to see what they're doing. Well, manatees don't have a weight belt, and guess what? They're hindgut fermenters with 30 meters of large intestine. I have maybe 4 feet, 5 feet of large intestine. They have 30 meters of this stuff. So they're going to float like a beach ball without some kind of ballast. And this is their ballast that kind of helps them maintain the neutral buoyancy in the water. And you'll feel how hard and solid those bones are. Now in a terrestrial, if you had bones like that in a terrestrial environment, that would be a real burden to you. In fact, we call that a disease in humans. And so what is a disease and recognized as a disease pathologically in a terrestrial form may not necessarily be true. That's an adaptation that has been worked to your advantage in an aquatic environment. So how good do they see? Well, if you look at a scale, and on this scale we have a human over here, and then we have a dog that sees a little bit better than we do. Most cases always smells and sees better than we do, certainly. We have the bottlenose dolphin, and then we have a legally blind. Well, cows aren't very good. Amazon River dolphins, we know, are almost entirely blind. Their eyes are dysfunctional in the water because they live in tar black water. They can't see anything anyway. So they've gotten rid of their eyesight. But look at what these manatees do. 2 captives, one was here and one was way off the scale. It could not functionally use its eyes at all. Now that's terrible if you're reading the Wall Street Journal and you can't see anything, you know. But manatees don't need to do that. They use their eyesight for something different. They don't need to come up and differentiate between, that blade of seagrass is better than that one. Let's see, I want that one, you know, and pick. They're not going through the produce market and picking out the type of produce that they think is the best to eat. They're going and gorging everything. But they'll use their vision to see these shades, like if you were an airplane pilot and you're flying and you use an artificial horizon to tell you up and down. Manatees can use this to show shades and distinction in the water to help them probably orient when they're swimming through the water. But more importantly, they don't use their eyes that much. These little beady eyes on the side, if you take your finger and you go up close to it, you'll flinch, you know, they're using it, they're looking at things, they are aware, they'll come up and investigate you, and sometimes they'll turn their head and it's almost like they're turning their eye at you. But we found that they have temporal bones on their skull, and these temporal bones are more oil-laden, lipid-laden, and it helps them to articulate sound and pull that sound in, because when we get in the water, our ears don't really help us that much. It's the vibration of the sounds against our hard bones, and manatees can do that using probably these temporal bones, some of the mandibular bones, and some of the bones related more closely related to the parietic in their complex. So they don't really use the eyesight. But we did notice that they have vibrissae on their face. And this vibrissae are little whisker-like hairs. We looked at them, and they're actually whiskers. And they're good for tactile response. In fact, this is a marvelous organism. This mandibular proboscis will literally come up and can work like a hand. It can grab and manipulate and pull things. And I know that from experience. I have 3 swimsuits. I have a blue swimsuit. I go out with the manatees, and I'm cool, I'm swimming with the manatees, and they ignore me. I have a yellow swimsuit, and I go out with the manatees, and I swim with them and ignore me. And I have a green swimsuit, and I go out with the manatees with my green swimsuit on, it's flapping in the water like a piece of lettuce. They grab it, and they try to pull it off. And so we know they have rods and cones. We know they can see color, and they prefer greens because it's associated with what they like to eat. And they're utilizing that to see the colors, to look at those kinds of things. And they're using this prehensile thing to grab it. Now, the other thing that I would do in the water is I swim up to a manatee and it's sleeping. And if it's on the bottom and it's sleeping, and I have to sex the manatee, I have to wait for it to take a breath, get underneath, and take a look. And often when I would do that, I would go like this and start to look, and it rolls over completely like that. And I haven't been able to see what sex it is. And they can hold their breath for 10 or 15 minutes, so it's a long time if you're an impatient biologist and you want to get some information about the sex of that individual you just took a photograph of and you're trying to document. So I have a trick. I go up next to them, and I put my hand next to their side, and I go up and I touch the anus. And if I swipe my hand forward, I can feel the urogenital aperture. I know it's a female. If I don't feel something there, I know it's a male, because the urogenital aperture is up by the belly button in the middle. So when I would go up to a swimming manatee, and I'm pretty quiet in the water, and I'm neutrally buoyant because I have my weights on, and I drop down and put my hand on that sleeping manatee, it starts to turn, and I'm still 4 inches from the side of the body, and it's turning away from me. So he's sensing my presence there. So the next question we had, what are the hair densities on the body? So somebody went and counted all the hairs on the manatee body, and they found the densest patches of hair were right here at the back on the rump, which is your blind side. And there's probably a reason why they have more hair back there. It's probably not to stay warm, because it wouldn't be very functional in the water anyway. But we did look at those hairs, and we found, like the whiskers, these true whiskers on the face, pledge hairs also were whiskers. And they were able to detect vibration and movement in the water like a lateral line does on a fish. So manatees now don't really have to have eyesight to see things. They can feel in their environment what's going on around them. And this could be as much as approaching boats. This also could be inanimate objects. If a manatee is swimming along and this is a tree stump, it'll sense something's there and go around it. And we learned this because we got real tricky. We put some water, fresh water, in a marine site. We ran it, and we baited the manatees in. They would come up to the water, and they would drink. So we would go out and stand there with a net, and then when they would go up to the water to drink, we could walk that net behind them and catch them like a little purse and pull them up onto the beach. So I'm standing there. The water's running. I haven't moved. It's been like 20 minutes. Nothing's happening. I see no disturbance at the surface. The water's this deep, and something starts chewing on my booty. And so the manatee is in that environment, which is pitch black, cannot possibly be using any eyesight, and it knows where my booties are. Not that they smell or anything like that, but it obviously can sense where those booties are and investigate that I am some kind of novel object that's in the water that wasn't there before. And that's where manatees kind of get into trouble. They're curious animals. Curiosity is bad in the manatee world because you throw something into the water that's novel, they're going to go investigate it. If you throw trash in, they're going to go try to eat it. If you put people in, they're going to go play with them. If you put anything in, they're going to check it out. So we become novel objects when we're in their environment. And it's probably kind of startling to them because we don't behave like your typical mammal. You know, there shouldn't be, if we have scuba on, bubbles are coming out, oh, that's not right. You know, it shouldn't be doing that. Something's wrong with you. You're making regulator noise when you breathe. They like it to be quiet and calm. And if you become quiet and calm in the water, then they're going to be less responsive to the actions that you have. They're going to be feel less threatened by that behavior. So it pays really to be calm and collective. It's always better to, if you're in the water swimming and you're a researcher and you see a manatee, to let that manatee discover you before you startle him. Because if you startle that individual, it's going to swim away. If that doesn't work, it's going to swim away farther. If he discovers you or she discovers you, turns to you, figures you're not a threat, she'll go back into the same pattern. So we've noticed that time and time again. And that's not because these are just sea cows, you know, meandering around in a fenced area with no intellect at all. These are really premeditated kinds of individuals. And we've learned a lot about those individuals that are out there. In fact, we find that cow and calf pairing is really important. That this educational process that this calf has, and it's about 3 to 4 feet when it's born, weighs maybe 40 to 80 pounds, somewhere in that range, and will it maintain, you know, adult size in 50 or 60 years if you live to be that long, complete adult size length. But it'll reach adulthood in about 5 to 6 years, 7 years, somewhere in there. It'll stay with the mother, and the mother will train the baby. And the mothers come into a population, and they have a cow and a calf. A male or a female calf. They'll have one calf. Twins are very rare. Twins are about 1% of the time, 1.8% of the time. So twinning is about the same as it is in human populations. So they're not producing large litters of offspring. So when they're endangered, it takes them a long time to pull a population back up and out of the low numbers. But it's that dedication that, being this case selected, that they have, that they need to train that calf. The mother starts training it from day one. And she won't release it until she's through. Now, if you're a manatee and you live in a St. John's freshwater system and you have a calf, you're going to keep the calf about 1 year and then you're going to wean it. If you're in Crystal River, over in a marine system, you're going to keep the calf about 2 years, you're going to wean it. And that's because now you don't just have to say, well, I'm training you, I'm in the St. John's River, and this is fresh water, and when it gets, you eat all of this. You know, it's pretty easy to master that. And then the other thing you have to master is when it gets cold, you swim upriver or downriver until you hit warm water. Two-dimensional movement, and you find your reprieve, which is the warm water that you need. Whereas in a marine environment, you have to teach them where to find warm water, where to find fresh water, where to find the vegetation, how seasonality impacts all of that stuff, becoming more complicated. And then you get into some of these island and Caribbean situations, and the moms might keep the calf for 3 or 4 years, where it's really complex. You have to go suck on that mangrove root to get some fresh water substance out of this system because there isn't enough rainfall that time of year. Really complex kinds of things. Once mother has decided that the calf is ready to wean, she weans the calf off and it goes off. Now if she weans the male calf to do one thing, it does it. She trains them both to do the same thing, the male and the female calf. she trains the female calf to be a good breeder like her, and that's to supply nutrition to make babies. And so this is feeding, high priority. This is what we do. The female calf will probably do that and inherit what the mother in the matrilineal lineage trained her to do, like the elephants. And the male will go off and probably sort of do what she did, but it has more of an association with other cohorts, other males that are in the juvenile range. And then you get the ziggers and the zaggers together, and now you've got a decision. You know, do I go where mom told me to go, or do I follow this guy? Well, he's kind of my buddy. So they ziggers, and so who's the leader and who's the follower kind of thing builds into what happens with this complex kind of association. But genetically, it's a good thing, because all of your breeders aren't doing the same thing and going to the same place, and even your offspring are bridging off and going somewhere else where some other mother trained her calf to do that. And so we presume, and we hypothesize that that's really what's going on, but again, we need concrete data. So the books and information that we've written about manatees have been useful, but there's still a lot we don't know about manatees that we're learning every day, and that's why they don't cease to amaze us. Now, we do know when it gets cold, they go to these power plants and warm water sites where there's lots of water being discharged, and each of these is a 1,000-pound manatee, so slugs of manatees literally come into these areas. This is Crystal River, 2 sites in Crystal River, where they're protected and they're in the sanctuary, and they even spill out in some situations. There are so many manatees now. So we've seen positive growth in the manatee population over time, the last 40 years. That's a good thing. We've also seen the number of mortalities go up related to boat strikes. And so we're real concerned that there's a lot of manatees dying. But we also have more people dying on the interstate every year in Alabama, but we're not worried we're not going to have enough people. So what we're seeing is we're having more births of manatees than we are deaths per year. And it's that birth plus that's been adding to the population. Now what that'll do to the population, it can change the demographic. You could have 5,000 of one population, and in that population you've got 4 elementary schools. That sounds pretty good. You've got 5,000 people in this population over here, and you don't have any elementary schools, but you've got 4 nursing homes. So they're both 5,000, and to someone that's doing management might say, well, we're just achieving a number. That's not as healthy a population as the one that has the elementary school, the younger population. So it's good that we are putting in new recruits in the population, but they suffer the consequences of maybe not being, them being more naive and not being able to avoid perturbations and those kinds of things. So manatees come in and utilize these warm water sources during the winter, take advantage of it, and it's a life or death situation. If they're deprived of that opportunity, they literally will die. Now we know this because we can follow certain individuals, and we come in with slates and we take photographs of them, and we know, like, for example, these horrible mutilations make these unique individuals. But what this tells us is that that's a different manatee than that one. So now instead of just saying, well, we had one manatee that I might have seen the same manatee on the same day or a different day, now we can identify them. So we have a catalog. And in that catalog, there's 4,100 manatees that have been identified in the southeastern United States. So it's a big catalog, lots of mug shots. We know the individuals that are out there. Every day, every year, some of them die in the catalog. Eventually, they're all going to die. I mean, face it, we are all going to die. But at some point, we can track to see what survival estimates and survival rates are in the population. And we have noticed that over time, things have changed. At Crystal River, the population in the 80s was about 120 animals, and now it's up to over 1,000 now in Citrus County. So the population has grown incredibly and almost just really started to take off the last couple of years. So we think that there might be density-dependent issues that are going on with the population of manatees. You know, when manatees are hunted in a population, they're culled out, there's only a few individuals left. We find it very difficult to find them, to hunt them, to kill them, because they're so elusive and they're so quiet and stealthy. But those manatees can find each other to breed. So in most places, manatees don't go extinct. They become functionally extinct sometimes, and the numbers go so low in countries where they're hunting them, but the fishermen stop, and then the manatee population comes back, and then they hunt them again, and it comes back, and they hunt them again. So it's a cycle that takes place, but it's hard to eradicate manatees from the population. I'm happy to say that, because unfortunately people have tried to do that all the time. In some countries, people still kill and eat manatees. It's against the law, but have been hunted for centuries. Now, how difficult are they to see? This is an example using aerial survey of a place in Crystal River. We can look at these manatees and we can go, well, okay, in Crystal River, and this is topped off vegetation, hydrilla. So these are manatees that are swimming around. Like I said, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'll write 5 down, fly on. Well, if you were a swimmer in a boat and you got out and you swam, you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you'd go along here and you'd hear, sounds like marching boots in the mud. It's a manatee chewing. And so they'll literally will be eating their way underneath this stuff where they can't be seen. Even in crystal clear water, they can't be seen, but they're there. And they're not detectable. And I use this as an example of here's crystal clear where it's the best of conditions, but when there's vegetation underneath, you can't see them, you're not going to be able to see them. Most of the places manatees live, 90% of the places where manatees live, you can't see your hand in front of your face. It's pitch dark water. And so the only time you see them is when they come to the surface to take a breath. And it's almost like, you remember those old Jiffy Pop popcorns? You used to shake them and then you'd see them pop, pop, pop. Start counting the popcorn sometime. It goes pop, pop, 1, 2, 3, and then you get overwhelmed with all these poppings. And then you don't know if the first one was counted before or, So it's very difficult to count manatees under those kinds of conditions. You have to come up with estimates. And you have to come up with sighting probabilities for detection that you can correct for. So it becomes very difficult to count manatees. So the big question is how many manatees are there? And we're really not sure, but we know from the last synoptic survey, that they did, there were 6,250 manatees. So they suspect that there are over 6,000 right now. And that's on a trend that's been showing pretty good growth in the population. So we've been pretty excited about that. So much so that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has reclassified the manatee, from endangered to threatened in the Endangered Species Act. Fortunately, they're still protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. They still afford the same protections. But different priorities might be there if you're a threatened species versus, well, now we're only dealing with endangered because we want to put our more bang for the buck wherever we can. So there might be less funding available down the road in the long run. But we've had assurances from the managers. Yeah, right, just what we need. Assurances, we really don't get the assurances. We're told that nothing's going to change. Trust me. But we need assurances to make sure that those things don't change. So the synoptic survey results of 6,250 follow a trend over time that has pretty much shown this population growth. And if you make these calculations biologically of what the biological potential is for manatees, we do see that there's population growth that's likely taking place at every site in every place that we've monitored manatee populations throughout their range. So that's a good sign. We can do health assessments by catching manatees, putting them on boats. We pull them ashore, bring them up. If you've been part of our Crystal River manatee health assessments, we've done about 250 manatees there. And it's through those studies we're looking at impacts of the environment and habitat might have on carrying capacity and other things that could be affecting that population. So real important stuff that's helping us guide through that program and to lead us. During health assessments, we look at temperature, oral temperature, we look at heart rate, we look at respiration rates, we draw blood, we do everything you would do if you were going to a physical for yourself, and then at the end we can profile how that manatee is doing. We do some real nice body mass indices studies now that can tell us the condition of the animal based on the length and the girth and the weights and some of those other factors. We have ultrasound machines that can measure the subcutaneous blubber layer to tell us basically how much fat's associated with that manatee. So these are all good things that help us to draw a composite picture of the manatee. And Crystal River manatees are doing pretty well. There still are. But our expectation is that as power plants are mothballed to the south, manatees are going to have to go where? To natural places. The only natural places on that west coast that are predominant are Crystal River and some of those big springs. If we don't protect the waterways that are in there and preserve the quality of the water that's coming out of that spring, there won't be enough carrying capacity there just for warm water to keep the manatees healthy. But we also need to be concerned about the amount of vegetation that's out there as well. So lots of things to do. I mean, we called the manatee threatened now, but we still need to monitor and make sure, because when things resolve in the next couple of decades, when some of these power plants are turned off, and we can't run them forever. You might run them through my lifetime, but we're not going to run them through the manatee's lifetime that live to be 60 or 70 years old. So to learn about manatees, we put radio tags on them. And this is really interesting study because this allows us to get some inference about what's going on. And I'll use an example. They did an elephant. They caught an elephant and they put a radio tag on that elephant with their calf. And this was like 50 years ago or 30 years ago. And that mother took that elephant to a place where there was water out here in the east. And she went to another place and took that baby elephant to a water area to the west. And then she went just with that elephant and took it to a real small little spring over here in the south. Then they took the radio tag off. The mother had since died. The calf was 25 years old now. And they said, well, let's put a radio tag on that calf and see what the calf does. And they put the radio tag on this calf elephant now that's a 25-year-old. It's a big guy now. And they had just coincidentally the worst drought ever. And during that drought, that elephant went to the west water hole where most of the elephants go, and they were littered with carcasses and bodies of elephants that had died of dehydration. So that elephant, they tracked it, and it went to the west watering hole, another substantial watering hole, and it was dry, and there were elephant carcasses there. And it went to this south watering hole, the small spring that just that elephant knew about, and there was water. And that elephant survived. And it was related back to what that mother had trained that calf to do and what was important, and that calf had that choice. And I think that's true of these manatees too. The mother teaches them, and then they have options. And if they go to one place and there was water there and it's off, they've got plan B and they need to find fresh water somewhere else. They're going to utilize that. And we've seen that in the telemetry studies that we've done. They're non-invasive. We put a belt around the tailstock, a tether, and a floating transmitter. Ruth does some of this work up here in Alabama, and we get some really good results once we have these units out there. And the old way of looking at this was the UTM coordinates, and I put this in as an example of here's the middle of Florida. This is Brevard County, and then this is Miami down here. And if we take the air temperature and we drop it below 20 degrees Celsius, that manatee is happy, and then it hits 20 degrees Celsius and it goes down and finds warm water. And then it stays down there during the duration of the winter. And then in the summer, it actually started to go back when it warmed up, and then it got cold again and it shot right back down. And this was a couple hundred miles, so it's a substantial move. And then it went back into Brevard County, where it likes to stay. There's very good habitat in Brevard County for manatees. So what does this mean? If we look at a manatee, and here's multiple years, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of data, that manatee liked Brevard, winter, Brevard, winter, Brevard, winter, Brevard, winter. It became the heartbeat or the rhythm of this manatee. And as a biologist, we became so good at differentiating what was going on that when the tag would come off, we could go back literally to this rock that she swam by the day before or the year before and wait for her, and there she is. She swims by. These are literally creatures of habit. They don't like change, and that's what's a little worrisome, because all of the places this manatee goes to are a power plant. And if that's gone, what's going to happen when that manatee has to make a decision, keeps going to power plants that are all turned off? So we have to literally think from a management concept, how do we condition manatees to wean them away from dependence on power plants before the big day and we turn them off? If we turn them off, we're going to have a real problem. If we treat it like a library, you go to the library and you read a book. Somebody flips the lights off, turn the lights on, I can't read. Turn the lights on, okay, now I can read. But pretty soon somebody keeps turning those lights on, flipping them. I'm not reading my book in here, I'm going to go somewhere else. We've got to train manatees to do that. Make them irritable enough about our unpredictable behavior that they end up doing things and taking chances and educating themselves about other options. That's going to be the solution for manatees down the road. So here's a radio tag that was put on a manatee. And this is data that was collected from the old platform terminal transmitter, which is a Doppler effect Argos tag that goes polar orbiting satellites. It's not very accurate, but it does give you locations. But it doesn't, it just says, well, I got a location here, and then the next location was over here. These blue lines link them together. And if we look at that, it says, well, it gives us some information. They like it here, they like it here, 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 and here. And this was on the manatee just for 2 weeks. That's how much generation of information, or a couple months, I guess. But during this time, they had the tag on the same manatee for a 2-week period. And this is how the data looked during that 2-week period when we used GPS technology. That's the same data. And so that's telling us, yeah, they like it here, but look at, these are the corridors they use to get down to here. And they don't go, you know, they don't go this way, so don't put your speed zones, waste your energy and your effort doing that. This is informative to managers to help them make decisions about what's going on with the population that's out there. This is a very good tool, and it really will help you understand where the areas are that are critical to the manatees. Then you can go by there by boat. You can do assessments and surveys. You can determine you know, what's wrong or why they're there and why they chose that spot. Behavior, they're semi-social. They have migration and movements that are very complex in some cases, but some home ranges are within a couple of miles of the location. They have a kissing during greeting, which is an interesting behavior where that muzzle, which is very prehensile, they come up and they greet each other and push their muzzles together. We don't know if it's a form of recognition between clans or individuals. Again, new information. We're going to have to figure that one out. Reproduction is a mating herd. The female goes into estrus. The males chase her down and they breed with her. It's a scrambling kind of mechanism that it's effective, but again, a density-dependent issue. It works really well if only 2 of your suitors are after you, but if there's 30 or 40 of them, there can be overbreeding that can result in death. And we're seeing a little bit of evidence of that now. And there's feeding behavior out there that's very complex and driven by the types of vegetation. They have preferences. There's certain types of food they like, some they don't like. So there's a lot to learn about that. And they're herbivorous. The threats that are out there are many. You know, boats hit and kill manatees all the time. We know about that one. It's about 1 out of every 4, but about 1 out of every 5 dies from some human direct interaction. And then red tide, cold stress syndrome, perinatal mortality related to complications during birth, other things kind of play into the factor too. So mortality has been a big impact. Watercraft mortality is bad because boats hit manatees. People don't intentionally see them and run them down like they might on a road, you know, to hit an animal, but it's accidental usually. But if you're better informed, you can help save that manatee. And you can do that the same way we protect our kids when school's in session. We put the yellow blinking light out there to warn us and remind us that school's in session, we should go slow while the kids are out of the playground. Well, manatees, same kind of thing. Slow the boats down when manatee aggregations are around to protect those manatees when you need to. Cold stress syndrome, it can cause peripheral vascularization issues and necrosis and those kinds of things associated with direct contact with the cold. Red tide is also a problem. Works okay if you're a dog and you're on the beach, you sniff the red tide and you pass out and you wake up with a hangover. And then the next morning you're okay. If you're a manatee and you sniff red tide and you pass out, you're underwater, you don't breathe, you drown. Very severe for the manatees. And red tide problems are mostly within the Southwest, but we're seeing evidence of that now in other areas where this is encroaching into other regions. We have to be very cognizant of these kinds of things because manatees are vulnerable to that. And Toxicosis is from a dinoflagellate and get in tunicates and other things. Causes a neurologic condition to the manatee. They can take it either aerosol or ingestion through tunicates, and it causes neurologic disruption and ultimately death. Can cause ultimately death. If you catch them in time, get them out of that environment, they'll detox and they'll clear out. But you've got to respond to that, so that's a very active program. Ecosystems that manatees have are very diverse. Some of them are very much influenced by humans. Others are pretty natural, pristine areas, but we need to gravitate away from this and provide more of the natural habitat that's out there, or protect what we do have for manatees. And I'll advise you the manatee population is growing, and it's dispersing right now and expanding. It's expanding into these regions in the Gulf of Mexico and other places where you may not have had slow for manatee signs in the past, but you're going to get them tomorrow. Because manatees are going to start to habituate and utilize the habitat that's up here, because it's good habitat for manatees. It has everything they need. Management and conservation is driven by the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. Those are the two acts that protect the manatees. The Florida Manatee Recovery Plan is another plan that helps to direct where the research and efforts go, and that's based on a status review, stock assessment, and what constitutes the critical habitat that's out there for manatees. So it could be, you might save the last manatee from being hit by a boat, but the last manatee ultimately might die because there isn't enough vegetation out there. And so we really need to make sure that they have vegetation, they have warm water, and they have freedom for migration that they can do without getting chopped up by boats. And in the end now, we've got 4 management units in Florida. That's what they look like. I kind of think of them in terms of this. These are the artificial and passive warm water sites that are in Florida, and the natural ones. And this is where our 4 units kind of overlap today. And that's what is the situation today. But tomorrow, as these power plants are shut down, and they will be shut down, that's a guarantee before manatees go extinct. It might be the reason they go extinct. Tomorrow, we're only going to have these natural sources that we're going to have to enhance, and we're going to have passive systems that are influenced by warmer waters or currents or things that they can take advantage of. And now what happens is we have 3 essential management units that we have, and I like to think of it as 2 eyes and a big smiley face. So in general, keep the habitat and the environment safe and clean for manatees, the water quality, and it's going to be better for all of us and all of planet Earth. So we need to continue to do that. We need to get our pollution down, and you usually end with a sunset, but I like to call this the sunrise because the future for the manatees is kind of out there for us. They don't understand politics, they don't understand lobbying, and that's our rules and what regulates a lot of the sentiments we have for the wildlife that's out there. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah, we were very concerned with that a number of years ago, and we found the genetic diversity is a little bit better than we thought, though there is still low genetic diversity in the Florida population. But what they also found was that there were, if you look at that with traditional population sizes and low allelic diversity, it would define as being a problem. But so would elephant seals. And elephant seal populations went down to 200 individuals 30 or 40 years ago, and now they're up to 20,000. And they have no indication of inbreeding problems or artifacts at all. Whereas you take the Florida panther, we've driven that to extinction. We've seen all of the low inbreeding problems that they've had, and they've done really poorly. So some species are pretty resilient, and I think manatees are more resilient than we give them credit for. But we always try to err on the conservative side. You want to be cautious. You want to have a conservative approach. And for years, we were very concerned about that. But I'm not as much concerned about that as I am about some of these other issues that are coming up confronting the manatee. And it's probably because of that mating system mechanism. They would be in big trouble if they all bred in the winter at these aggregation sites, and everybody's breeding with their brothers and sisters. But as they disperse out and they move, they get pandemic mixing in the population that does help. But all granted, there's low genetic diversity in Florida because of a founder effect that occurred about 10 to 15,000 years ago with the last ice age that went through. And if we go back 100,000 years ago, it was a different subspecies. It was Trichechus mannatus bakeri. And bakeri had the same rostral deflection. It was the predecessor to the manatees in Peninsula Florida, but they were here 100,000 years ago and died with the last ice age. So we got to keep these around.
Fortunately, we can turn this off, but you know, we're trying to educate people in case Trump's watching. But if their climate change continues, manatees might be one of the species that does pretty well.